All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining this webinar where Kali and I talk about our joint training on psychological safety. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Edgar Jatu, and I'm the Executive Director of Workplace Fairness, and I've been the Executive Director now for about 5 years. And my background is in employment law practice for 9 years. And at Workplace Fairness, what we do is we educate the public on workers' rights laws around the country by cultivating over 400 pages of content that helps people understand their rights at work. So we cover everything from discrimination to wages, and now we're also going to cover the idea of psychological safety in the workplace as well. And I would like Kali to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Edgar. My name's Kylie Van Leeuwen, and I am the founder of Elevated Coaching and Consulting Global. My background is executive leadership in the nonprofit sector in Australia for about 5 years, nope, 15 years, 5 years to make my career very short. I've got qualifications in human resources and leadership, but I'm also a psychotherapist and emotional intelligence coach and human rights consultant. So we do a lot of work in the coaching and consulting space. And I started Elevated Coaching and Consulting Global a little over 2.5 years ago now, when I was still in Australia. And we use the coaching and consulting streams of Elevated to support businesses and leaders and teams to elevate their practices and transform organisations, and also to empower individuals to reach their full potential and thrive. So we do a lot of work in the diversity, equity, inclusion, and psychological safety space, and we help employers, leaders, and teams to really foster that psychological safety for all employees in their organisations.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Kali. Um, and I think one thing that I wanted to start with is for those on the webinar who don't know what psychological safety is, Kali, can you just give a definition of what psychological safety in the workplace means, so our people understand?
Yeah, absolutely. And always when we talk about psychological safety, I preface it by saying it's really important to differentiate between psychological safety and psychosocial safety, because what we find is that a lot of people use those two terms or definitions interchangeably, and they are quite different. So psychological safety in the workplace is the right to feel safe at work, being able to speak up or speak out when you feel threatened or overwhelmed, and knowing that you won't be punished or threatened or embarrassed when you speak out. And this is a culture where employees feel safe to take risks, express their thoughts, and be themselves without fear of retribution, which is, I'm sure everybody on this webinar can understand why that's critical and important. Psychosocial safety refers to a safe environment. So, organizational systems that are clear, easy to use, and supportive, safe social systems. So, when we're thinking about people and relationships, and psychosocial risks are negative factors that can harm employees' well-being and productivity. So, it's important because it fosters positive workplace culture. It fosters trust, collaboration, respect, innovation, and employee well-being, which then in turn leads to things like higher productivity, morale, employee engagement, job satisfaction, and retention, which is all those things that we all want as leaders and organizations.
Thank you so much for that, Kali. And before we move on, I just want to tell everyone that if you have questions for us, please feel free to use the Q&A function to ask your questions. We want this to be a free-flowing conversation about this topic, so feel free to ask questions as we go on. So, Kali, one question I have for you, I think this comes up a lot when I talk to my friends about psychological safety, is that there are some misconceptions. So, can you talk about some of the common misconceptions around psychological safety in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, isn't it? You have a lot of people that have these beliefs and those assumptions that it's either something that's going to be really difficult to implement in an organization. But when we break it down, we look at the whole picture. But then when we break down all the elements that make up a psychologically safe workplace, it actually is really quite simple. So some of the misconceptions that we see is that people often confuse psychological safety with being overly soft or avoiding accountability. or not addressing things like underperformance. Some people also think that it means that everyone always agrees. We know that
Right.
that's just not human nature or the case, and we don't all want to agree on everything because then it stifles things like innovation. So that's not the case. Another, probably the most critical misconception that we try and educate and build awareness around is that psychological safety in the workplace is not solely the responsibility of the human resources department. Okay, it's not one person's job to foster, create, or maintain workplace psychological safety. It's really a shared commitment and responsibility. It is initially up to the leaders and the leadership team to lead that change and really walk the talk when it comes to fostering psychological safety. But it is everybody's commitment. It's a shared commitment, and every employee in an organisation has a responsibility to contribute to and foster a psychologically safe workplace. Uh, the last one that I would say is that often when we have those initial conversations with leaders, they think that it's a one size fits all approach.
Hmm.
So that they believe that often there's a universal approach to creating psychological safety. But in reality, it really does vary based on things like the organization's culture and the team dynamics and I guess the personalities as well of the leaders and some of those things that are already happening in the workplace. So I would say that they're probably the key misconceptions that we hear about.
I mean, I love that response, and I think you laid out a lot of the not misconceptions, but also I think making a good business case for why you want psychological safety in the workplace. And one golden nugget I took from your response is the idea of creating spaces where people can be innovative and creative in their work.
Mm.
And when you're in workplaces that don't have that, productivity suffers greatly, right? And I
Yeah.
think we've all maybe we didn't call it that before, but we've also been in workplaces where people are afraid to share their ideas or to speak up when they disagree with something, and that goes beyond sort of uh, the HR related or HR legal compliance issues that might come up if you don't have good psychological safety culture in a workplace. And
Mm.
so, to that end, Kylie, and I'm sure a lot of people on this chat and who will be listening, watching this, can you know identify this. But what are some key things I want you to look for a psychological safe workplace?
If you, for example, if we go in as consultants and have an initial conversation, the thing that we're looking for to identify whether it's psychologically safe or whereabouts the organization is on that journey, some of the things that we typically look for is, are the employees engaged? That's probably one thing. Are they comfortable sharing ideas with us as consultants? The more we sort of go out and we consult and we engage with the teams, are they comfortable sharing ideas, asking questions as well? Because typically in an organization where psychological safety is lacking, people like you were saying, Edgar, they tend to really withdraw and step back. Not only do they not ask questions, they don't participate. They start to really not even, they'll attend meetings but not really be present and certainly not actively participate. The other thing that we look at is when we're looking at data in an organization, we look at their retention rates. We look at things like their talent attraction and their recruitment practices as well. Um, we usually get share things like employee engagement surveys and satisfaction and things like that. But they're the things that we typically look for. Also, their tolerance levels to things like discrimination, their
Mm-hmm.
commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, and belonging. Because if they're not really talking about those things, or the leaders don't believe it's important, or there's a real lack of commitment there, you're safe to assume that there's some psychological safety issues there in that organization as well. Um, and I guess one of the other things is that when we talk about staff contributing or participating, mistakes aren't seen as a bad thing. They're seen as just something that happens and opportunities for
Right.
learning or growth. Um, So they would be some of the things that we look for that indicate the level of psychological safety in an organization. But because we always start with the leaders, as do you when you're
Right.
doing your consulting, that's the first place and the place where there's, the greatest opportunity to execute change. If the leaders have a really high degree of emotional intelligence and you can tell that they're genuinely committed to not only creating and maintaining psychological safety in the workplace, but also they're really open about what they don't know, then I
Right.
think I think that you're working with a great group of leaders and you should experience some success in implementing it.
Awesome. And Jason Forehand has a question for us. And his question is, where do you start with a company that understands they need to create change but don't know where to begin?
Oh, I would say, and thank you, Jason. Jason's one. I'm one of their advisory board members, and they're doing absolutely awesome work over at HR for you. So shout out to Jason. I would say have a look at how you're communicating. And it sounds really basic, but typically, open and effective communication is typically one of the things that's lacking in a workplace that doesn't have psychological safety or is lacking psychological safety. So one of the things that I would say is start there, have a look at how are you communicating with your team members. And that means the organization wide, not just leader to leader, but how are you fostering open communication in the organization? Do people feel safe to communicate
Hmm.
upwards, downwards, sideways? All of those things. So that would be something that I would say. Also, I mean, the leaders have to do a lot of reflection as well. And sometimes that's a tough thing is that self-reflection. But one of the things that we do with our clients is look at the leadership styles, look at things like how are they engaging with their teams, particularly when they're embarking on a change that could be quite large and a long journey that's essentially never ending when it comes to DEI and psychological safety, but really looking at the leadership practices and do the leaders have a high degree of emotional intelligence and how
Right.
are they going to lead this change in fostering or creating psychological safety, but also are they open-minded and aware of the challenges and shortfalls that they may have in the organization. So I think it's starting there and then building on that.
Great response. And to I want to also give the other side where, you know, what are what are what do workplaces look like where there is no psychological safety, particularly from your experience? So you're hired by someone, you walk into a workplace, and what are things you look for to identify, okay, this place does not have great psychological safety for workers?
Well, the first thing probably that's the easiest because it's data is, and we do have a lot of these conversations, is when leaders say to you or a CEO says to you, we're advertising all these roles because we know globally there's such skills and workforce shortages at the moment. Still, what, 4 years on from the pandemic, they will come to us and say, we're advertising for all these roles. We're not either attracting candidates or we're
Hmm.
not attracting the right candidates, but also we're not retaining people. So we might be then finding some of the right people after quite a long period of time, but we're having real retention issues. But our employee engagement surveys, they're mediocre. They're not great, but they're not
Right.
terrible. My response to those types of things, which are real red flags for me, would be people might say they're engaged and they might be positively or somewhat positively responding to your employee engagement surveys out of fear,
Right.
right? Or not wanting to be totally honest and communicate, what's really their experience as an employee. But also, when retention rates are low, and you're losing a lot of talented people, or your talented high performers are leaving, but there's staff that are underperformers or quite mediocre performers, they're remaining, then that would be a big red flag for me, and it is. Um, so those are some of the real, sort of quick wins when you're looking at psychological safety. If you're losing people and not retaining them, then why is that?
Right.
The other thing would be if you're hearing, if you're doing exit surveys when people are leaving, if they're lucky enough to be open and communicate the reasons why. But if people are saying that they're burnt out or their workloads are too overwhelming, or their job is resulting in them feeling a particular way that is negative, like anxious, or you've got high absenteeism, you
Hmm.
know, or low productivity. So people might be coming to work, but they're quietly quitting, as they say, or they're not productive. Those are all things that I would think perhaps you don't have a high degree of psychological safety because people aren't engaged or motivated or enthusiastic.
Right. And Kelly, do you take a look at also the complaints that workers make on whether it's just purely based off of working conditions, or if they felt that they've been harassed or discriminated against? Is that data you look at as well?
We do. That's a little harder because it's that catch-22 typically when people are leaving an organization because they don't feel psychologically safe, although they usually don't use that terminology.
Right.
um, they usually won't have escalated a grievance. They will just leave, especially in the
Hmm.
US, as we know, there's not a lot of legislation, and that's your that's your area of expertise.
Yeah.
But we have talked a lot about that, you and I, is that especially in the US, people can make a grievance and for whatever reason, but not a lot, it, is legally required of employers to resolve those issues. The burden of proof and evidence is on the employee to say, I was harassed, or I
Right.
feel like I've been psychologically abused, or I've been discriminated against. And that burden of proof and evidence is really difficult, even in countries like Australia, where we have that legislation to protect workers. It is still really difficult to
Right.
prove. So I think that, back to your question, it's difficult when people don't feel psychologically safe to find out why they're truly leaving. People usually resign or retire, and they just don't want to go through the process of having to escalate a grievance. So they leave quietly, and then there's no further litigation typically,
Right.
especially here.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So does it stands to reason then that as part of the process of creating a psychological safe workplace, that part of it is having more clear ways for people to make complaints and to talk openly about their concerns, right?
Mhm.
And also tracking how those complaints or concerns are dealt with.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's it's also things like, and I think you and I've talked about this before, it's the simple things that leaders can do to not even need to get to that point, that
Yeah.
escalated point. It's fostering things like just giving your team members opportunities as a team, but also as individuals to have that time with you one on one in private that's regular, so that they know that they're having, a one-on-one fortnight is an Australian term, every second week. 8 months and I'm still using that term. But it's that regular opportunity for people to feel valued and respected, and that they have that one-on-one private time, and that opportunity to provide feedback to their leader or their supervisor to say, hey, listen, Edgar, I'm feeling really overwhelmed. My workload's just too great, and I'm noticing that I'm taking on a lot of the work of some of my colleagues. Can we do something about that? Because I'm
Right.
I'm starting to feel that, I'm not sleeping at night, and I'm anxious coming into work. I think that they sound like really simple things we can put in place, but so many leaders, because they're so time poor, they don't see the value in doing that. And
Yeah.
those are some of the mechanisms that are so easy to implement as leaders, to not even that physical giving time to people, but people, when you give them your time, they feel valued naturally,
Hmm.
especially if it's their opportunity to bring things to you as a leader. So I think simple things like that are really important, because that can stem and stop some of those issues escalating.
No, that makes a whole lot of sense. And I want to switch gears a little bit because you mentioned legislation in Australia, and fortuitously, Jason also asked a question about legislation. And so, the terms, the idea of psychological safety in the workplace is it's not something new. It's new to America or the United States, but it's not new globally. So can you maybe talk about some of the other places where women originate from globally and places where there's actual legislation on the books about it? And I want to maybe you know delve that dovetail that into a conversation about what's happening here in the United States around legislation around psychological safety in the workplace.
Mm. So in Australia, there's a federal legislation. So it's really different here because it's state-based, right?
Yeah.
Trying to have workplace psychological safety legislation picked up in the states, each state by state, hopefully. But in Australia, we have federal legislation, general protections legislation, but also industrial relations
Hmm.
legislation that protects workers from harassment, so all forms of harassment,
Okay.
discrimination. We also have anti-bullying legislation, but the legislation in Australia, what it allows is that if you and there's a couple of different avenues for people to escalate a grievance legally in Australia. So if you feel that you've been psychologically injured or harmed or treated
Hmm.
unfairly in the workplace, you can either go to the Fair Work Australia Ombudsman,
Okay.
and that's for things like bullying. I mean, gosh, a whole raft of things, bullying,
Right.
harassment, all of the, real high level nasty things that can happen in a workplace. And just because I'd like to preface, just because we have that legislation in Australia to protect workers doesn't mean it has stopped. It has actually escalated the
Right.
incidences of work place psychological injuries. And I think that's because more workers are coming forward because
Hmm.
they know their rights as workers, but also because they know they're protected and they have an avenue to then move to litigation.
Yeah.
Um, so that's one difference in Australia. There's also workers' compensation. So again, the number one claim for workers' compensation claims across all of Australia by a country mile is psychological injuries. The
Wow.
burden of proof, and it's even more than physical injuries. If you think
Wow.
about,
Yeah.
back injuries and people getting injured in,
Right.
things like manufacturing or more physical labor,
Mining. Yeah.
psychological injuries top the cases for workers' compensation claims across Australia. Um, and they've actually just brought in, I think, a week and a half ago, new industrial relations legislation in Australia, which any of the Americans joining us today might shake your heads or say that would never pass here, around the fact that employers now are no longer legally able to require workers to respond to them by phone, text, or email after business hours. That's huge that got passed in
Yeah.
Australia.
Yeah.
So there's some of the differences, but I think the main difference between what the US legislation is for worker psychological safety protections and countries like Australia is that people have an avenue as far as escalating the grievance, moving to litigation, but also having a safety net, a financial safety net of workers' compensation where they remain being paid um, all of their wage, and then it drops down to 80% of their wage for a period of time while that claim is being investigated. So it's around 12 weeks that you're on full pay out of
Wow.
the organization while the investigation takes place. Most people by then have formally resigned because you can't claim that you're psychologically injured and then remain in the workplace.
Right.
But there's some of the key differences. So people actually have an opportunity to leave the organization, but then pursue financial settlements and things like that.
Wow. That's incredible. That's so advanced in where we are right now, even with some of our current laws in certain states, especially. And litigation that you mentioned, is that just in court, or is there an agency to go through in Australia, or both?
So there's three main ways, and we do this work in Australia. We don't do this work over here, obviously, because we're
Hmm.
not uh, registered to. But there's three different avenues which we support clients that have been unfairly treated or have acquired a psychological injury in Australia. The first one is lodging a claim, regardless of what the harassment, bullying, whatever it might have been, with the Fair Work Australia Ombudsman. So
Okay.
typically with Fair Work is you'll lodge a claim and then you'll be given a hearing with the Fair Work Tribunal. And typically you'll come before the commissioner. So the employer and
Okay.
the employee and their representatives, whether it's myself, whether it's a lawyer, you come before them and it's an opportunity to mediate the situation. Both sides basically state their claim and what they're looking for as far as settling harmoniously and then walking away. If it's not resolved there, then you typically move to litigation in court,
Wow.
which, as we know, isn't pleasant, but
Yeah.
off we trot to court. And then the third way of resolving it is when somebody has, and typically you can do both of these things simultaneously, depending on how psychologically injured somebody is, because as you can imagine, the process is really very stressful. Often people will lodge a Fair Work Australia claim and be going through the mediation or going through with the commissioner
Hmm.
at the same time lodging a workers' compensation claim so that they still are earning their salary whilst
Right.
the investigation is taking place. And that again is something that typically can go on for months, if not years.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really amazing. And I would say that recently there has been some movement to pass psychological safety workplace laws in the United States. Nothing at the federal level yet, but you are finding that there is some legislation being passed in Massachusetts
Mhm.
or being worked on in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, the legislation that's being worked on um, just cleared one small hurdle, but I think that has legs. I believe that there's interest by the legislature to pass something in Massachusetts. So that's one place to keep your eye on. And also, DC, I think will be next in terms of potentially having maybe at least legislation be introduced, at the city council. Are you aware of any other places that are thinking about passing their own psychological uh, workplace safety laws?
In the States, I think Rhode Island is
Right,
pretty,
that's another
that
one.
that'll be another one too. So
Yeah,
hopefully, it's that domino effect, typically what you see. And I think
yeah,
it doesn't really matter where you are in the world. Whether you're in the UK, Europe, the United States, or places like Australia or New Zealand, once one state or one party, if it's more aligned to political parties, once one
right.
goes, typically what happens, and the more noise you make, right, as
Hmm.
advocates, once one state agrees to it and it passes, and people start talking about the impact that that is having on their lives, their mental health, their
Yeah,
well-being, but also once businesses start to say, okay, this isn't so bad, because I think the reason here is people are so scared of liability, but also litigation.
right.
Um, Once one state passes it, then hopefully it'll get passed in other states. And the more states that join and the legislation is passed, hopefully all the other states across the country will follow almost.
Yeah, no, I have high hopes that would happen. I think the big hurdle that has to be figured out is the enforcement piece,
Hmm.
and how do you do it and who does it?
Hmm.
I like the idea of an ombudsman
Mm,
because that's so different from anything that we that we know of here when it comes to enforcement um, and the workplace. And
mm,
so that's something that I might suggest people think about is maybe that that you could still have an agency, like particularly if you have a local agency that deals with human rights, and from there deals with employment issues, but maybe have an ombudsman that can come in and try to rectify the situation before it gets to a place where it has to go through an investigation process or go to
mm,
court. I
mm.
like that idea a lot.
Well, it's more neutral then, and I think I've gone before the commissioner, the Fair Work Commissioner, or
Hmm.
the commissioners within the Fair Work Australia, um, Fair Work Australia organisation. I've been before a few of their commissioners, and as a person representing employees, but I've also been on the other side as a leader in an organisation. going before them, they are viewed as neutral, a neutral party.
Hmm.
So that makes it very different.
Right.
They don't have any skin in the game, so to speak. They just want it resolved. Like like most courts, they just get out of my courtroom. We want to resolve this. So that is a really good thing, and that's at a federal level. And when it comes to workers' compensation, that's done at a state level, which I believe it needs to be managed by the state. So I'm not sure if, that kind of structure and system might work in the States, but definitely having something like an ombudsman would help organizations and companies and leaders feel that, they're also getting a fairly heard.
Yeah, and I believe what's different with an ombudsman than with a mediator, for example, because with a lot of state agencies, if you file a workplace claim, particularly let's say discrimination claim,
Mhm.
and you go to your local agency or federal agency, the EEOC, you do have a ADR process. So you can go to a mediator, and the mediator can try to resolve the claim. Uh, what I like about an ombudsman is that it's not just about resolving the claim, but getting to the root cause of the issue. That's what ombudsmen are trained to do,
Mhm.
is to not only try to fix or be a neutral and and help the parties communicate and resolve the issue, but really get to the root cause of what's causing the conflict,
Yeah.
right? And hopefully getting to a place where it doesn't happen again, or that the company sees the value of maybe hiring us to do a training for them, so that way so that way they don't have to worry about the creating a workplace that does not have psychological safety for its workers.
Mm.
So I really like that. I really like that idea.
Yeah, because the other thing to consider, and I have seen this a couple of times and is that you can go to the mediation, you can go to the ombudsman, and um, and this is rare, especially when it comes to psychological injuries or
Hmm.
psychological abuse. It's rare that somebody says, "Well, as part of the mediation, I want to remain here." I have had one
Hmm.
instance of that where the staff member wanted to remain in the organisation, um, or and also asked for a huge unrealistic settlement, financial settlement. And so, if you're not getting to the root cause and you have a staff member that's saying, "No, I don't want to leave this
Right.
organization. I've been here for 20 years. I'm invested." You have to get to the root cause, because then what will typically happen is they re-enter the workplace.
Hmm.
And if they're, you know, I don't know, if there's a meeting about their performance in the future, or they're called up for something else that may or may not be a valid concern from the employer, then they can turn around and say, well, that's that's discrimination because
Right. Right.
because I've lodged a previous grievance. And so exactly what you're saying, the ombudsman really needs to get to the root cause, resolve it completely so it doesn't come up later if that employee remains in that same workplace and doesn't leave.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's going to be fun to see how this takes in the United States, particularly in in the legislative level, where we're
Mm.
now putting in place laws, to rectify this. And the way I see it is, it's just more of a progression in terms of how workplace rights are established. Like we've done a lot of work particularly in the past in a couple of years on some of the longstanding laws that protect workers in the workplace, and now I feel this is a natural progression because it does affect a lot of people, right?
Mm.
And I think particularly with mental wellness being at the forefront of many Americans, I see it in a way as a public health issue.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, that people need to um, find more ways to enforce their ability to have good mental health, right? And
Yeah.
because we spend a lot of our time at work, a lot of our mental health stems from workplace issues.
Yeah.
I think if you were to walk around downtown DC and listen to people lamenting about their week, workplace issues are probably one of the top three things they talk about.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. And when we talk about psychological injuries in the US, in the workplace, one that absolutely tops the list is bullying.
Yeah.
and things like mobbing, which before I moved to the US, I'd never heard that term used before,
Yeah.
mobbing. And then when I looked into it and researched it, and it was just absolutely horrendous. Obviously, it happens in Australian
Yeah.
workplaces, and I've observed it, but it hadn't we hadn't didn't have a term for it. So
Right.
that's one of the number one things that happens as far as psychological injury is that so many people, the increasing incidence of so many people across the US experiencing bullying in their workplace, and psychological injuries like anxiety and depression, and
Right.
it leads to then the real scary things like people considering suicide. Like
Hmm.
that is horrendous that
Yeah.
people are experiencing those things in the workplace, and families are then affected as well.
Yeah. No, that's so true, and I think it buoys the point about it's a public health uh realization we're coming to, right? That
Yeah.
and something we something and it's not new, right? We do understand the connection between mental health and how it impacts families and communities. Particularly when you're dealing with serious things like someone taking their life, right?
Yeah.
Because they've gone to a place where they can't come they cannot resolve whatever they're going through. But I think equally with workplace issues, I mean, it's not exactly the same, but it can be. It can lead to that, you know, um, tragic conclusion.
Yeah.
We don't want that to happen at all.
No. No, and you see people that are I work with a lot of leaders, and sadly, a lot of them, and I was talking to somebody about this earlier this week, the main clientele we're seeing, probably for over the last 2 years, has been men between
Hmm.
40 and 55 years old in leadership roles that, for whatever reason, have been bullied, harassed, to the point where they've, resigned, retired early, left the organization entirely. But I would say over 90% of those clients that we support will never go back to leadership roles.
Mm,
And these are very, accomplished leaders, really educated. Again, like I said, most of them are men.
right.
And I'm just wondering, like, what is going on for this to be happening to a particular group of people? Um, Usually really at the height of their career, right? That have worked really hard all their life, gone off and received the education, to be holding those leadership roles. And then you find them doing, one of my clients is now doing security work because he just said, I don't have the drama. I
Mm,
don't,
hmm.
I can't go back into it. And it's almost, and he in particular, that gentleman I'm speaking about, he is being diagnosed with PTSD because of what he experienced in the
Oh, wow.
workplace. So it's just a little bit of a look into the long-term impacts and effects on people's mental health that, psychological injuries that are sustained or acquired in the workplace can really do to a person and then their families, because then
Yeah.
their earning capacity then is impacted as well.
Yeah. And Tracy had another question. And I think this is a good one because I think it would uh, tie a good knot around our more recent train of thought. How do you combat retaliation in Australia when it comes to psychological safety issues? And I think that would be a good question to talk about because it also would have some significance in America as we're trying to create more of a enforcement infrastructure around psychological safety at work.
So retaliation, as far as what I was talking about before, somebody lodges a grievance
Yeah.
and then the employer retaliates.
Yep.
Well, we have, under general protections legislation in Australia. Again, the burden of proof and evidence is on the employee. I have been involved in some cases where that has happened, where
Hmm.
people have returned into the workplace, or they've lodged a grievance with HR, lodged a grievance with the CEO, remained or tried to remain in the workplace and continue on. And then there's been retaliation from the leaders. That is, there's avenues through where Fair Work Australia where people can lodge a claim to say, well, my general protections were breached. because a year ago I lodged, or 6 months ago I lodged a grievance against my direct line manager, because I think that's where the fear is, right? For
Right.
everybody globally is you just do not complain about your direct line manager for fear of retribution or retaliation. But in Australia, there's legislation to protect complainants
Okay.
against that. I have also, on the flip side, as a leader, dealt with vexatious complainants as well. So where somebody has lodged a grievance, not directly about me, but somebody, you have addressed it with them, and then that person becomes a vexatious complainant. That's a little bit different to what we're talking about here. But there is legislation in Australia to protect people who not have been whistleblowers, but have
Right.
lodged a grievance. Um, I think the thing that works well, although it is stressful and very, very time consuming, is the burden of evidence and proof. If it is a genuine complaint where you have been the original or initial complainant as an employee, and sometime later that leader that has been involved in that, starts to target you in a way, or makes your workload heavier, or whatever way they might be targeting you in the workplace, and you link it back to that initial grievance. My advice and the things that work well in Australia is that as long as that is all documented, you have evidence, documentary
Hmm.
evidence that that has happened, then typically, you're okay. But that's when a person would need to go outside of their organization, um, especially the higher up in the leadership chain. If you're complaining about the CEO, I don't think HR is going to be able to help you, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Um, and often the other thing that I say to people is, human resources practitioners and divisions, they serve a purpose in an organization, and they are supposed to be, yes, a neutral party. However, when it comes to things like this, people need to remember human resources practitioners and departments are paid by the employer.
Right.
So, and that's something I talk about a lot in Australia, is you need to understand where the boundaries are as far as being
Hmm.
protected once you're saying that you've now been targeted by, a particular leader or the CEO. You need to go to, Fair Work Ombudsman or off to workers' compensation.
Yeah. That's a really great point. I think that gives us a good overview of what the legislation could look like here in the United States, and because we do have a model in Australia.
Mm,
So I want to talk about our training because we created this, partnership, and the goal of today was to was to give people an idea of what this topic is, if they were not familiar, but also to talk about our training. And and I would say that there are many people who are now doing this training, and it is starting to take um, to have more roots in the United States in terms of how people understand how workplace could look like for them.
mhm.
So from your perspective, what sets our training apart?
Well, I think when we sat down, it's been over a year since we first met. I was still in
Yeah.
Sydney, still in Australia. I
Yes.
believe it was a,
Yes.
a
Summer to
very
summer.
Yeah, that's it. It was a very early morning. I believe I was doing lots of 3 and 4 and 5 a.m. meetings then, which is nice. I don't do that now. But one of the things when you and I started talking about co-designing a training program was that we wanted it to be all inclusive. We
Right.
wanted it, we know that there's a lot of DEI, or diversity, equity, inclusion, and access and workplace belonging training out there. But what we wanted to do is also include this component, which is such a critical component of inclusion and diversity and building diverse workforces, which is also having psychological safety and psychologically safe
Right.
workplaces. So I think that's one of the points of difference, is that we really do come at the DEI aspect of this training, as well as the workplace fairness and the worker rights side of things as well, but we apply a psychological lens to it, and a human rights lens to it.
Right.
We, are looking at this as um, supporting leaders and teams and organizations to see the human beings, and to see every human being and what they need to be psychologically safe and feel respected and included in the workplace. And it sounds like a lot, and it is, but it's imperative, I think, as we move towards the future where we've got AI and we do have, workplace shortages globally.
Yeah.
Um, it's really important that when you are lucky enough as a leader and organization to attract talent, that you can retain talent. And especially if you're also an organization and a leader committed to attracting and retaining diverse talent, you absolutely have to create that psychological safety and then focus on, that attraction and how you're including people, because you cannot have inclusion without psychological safety.
Yeah.
So,
So that's a great response, and I think that really put well. And one thing I would add is what excites me about the training is that uh, we're looking at the workplace as a very uh, critical ecosystem in terms of how you support your workers so that you have a thriving business. And what is important to that is not only the psychological safety that you're providing, but it also impacts your DEI initiatives, right? And how people relate to one another. So workplace belonging, and but also with the compliance piece, it's understanding the significance of what mistake if you make these mistakes, what can happen, right? So understanding the legal or compliance apparatus that exists both at the local level, depending where you operating at the federal level
mm,
in the United States, and making sure that uh, that you maintain this fragile ecosystem, so that way you don't have to deal with the legal ramifications and, quite frankly, reputational ramifications of not having a psychologically safe workplace, not having good HR best practices, and more importantly, at least what we're trying to cover in this training, you know, not being mindful about HR compliance, right?
mm,
And how that and how failing at all these things or one of these things can lead to this unfortunate journey of having to deal with a lawsuit um, or a legal claim, that can impact, your operation as a business owner, can certainly, hit your pockets,
yeah,
and your bank account, and also can damage your reputation, internally with your current staff, and also externally with your community, people you do business with, customers and clients.
yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important too, because one of the other things that we look at in this program, in this training, is the intersectionality piece,
Yeah.
which,
Hmm.
if we're thinking about nonprofits that may not have the funds for an entire human resources department, which is quite common with the
Right.
nonprofits that we support, this training gives them the opportunity for, engaging their employees and saying, we're investing in you as far as professional development or leadership development to be going through this training. But also it's showing them the importance when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion of the role that intersectionality plays in that. And a lot of nonprofits, they're serving and supporting such diverse individuals,
Right.
families, and communities that a lot of the ones that I deal with, they don't realize that their services aren't as accessible because they haven't considered intersectionality. Their
Right.
staffing and
Right.
their personnel delivering the support services, they actually don't reflect and represent the majority of their clientele. So, disability support services that we work with, for instance, they say to me, well, we look at our staffing, it doesn't represent the people that we're supporting and
Hmm.
serving. And that's when there becomes that disconnect between the clientele, but also the staff providing, case management or employment services or settlement services or disability services, whatever it is. But you have to have things like cultural awareness and culturally
Right.
responsive practice, because we're not all the same human beings. And if you don't have those things and you don't consider intersectionality, especially as a nonprofit and a support services provider, then what happens is the client outcomes typically suffer. And like you
Right.
said, the client experience isn't as great as it possibly could be.
Yeah. So Jason asks, How are we rolling out this program to leaders and employers?
We are available.
Yeah.
Um, we we've got the website so people can
Yeah.
express their interest. It comes through to both myself and Edgar, and then typically the process from there is we jump on a discovery call and understand the needs of that organization
Right.
and that leader and or their team, because we can tailor this training to focus on things a little more if there is
Right.
more of a concern in one particular area. We do have a lot of people reaching out at the moment saying that, we have particularly need to really focus on things like microaggressions and biases.
Mhm.
And so we can tailor it a little to make sure that the attendees are getting exactly what they need from it. But typically Edgar and myself will jump onto a discovery call, understand what the need for the training is, and why they've reached out. And then we look at scheduling that so that it best fits in with all of the attendees and that team.
Yeah.
It's very simple.
And
We're keeping it simple,
yeah,
aren't we, Edgar?
yeah, definitely. And I want to add that we can do this training both virtually or in person, so there is flexibility there. And I think one of the biggest things for me is it does, I know that for many leaders of organizations, this can be tough, right? It can be tough to acknowledge, especially if in some way that you could be doing better as a leader to promote a more healthier workplace. But we'll meet you where you are. That's probably the most important thing. I think for me, what I care most about is a willingness to learn and to try and to challenge your assumptions about certain things.
Mm.
So no matter what's happening in your workplace, if you have that willingness to learn more and to confront the challenges, we'll work with you. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah. And you and I've both got a lot of experience, don't we, Edgar, working with
Yeah,
leaders at all different levels of leadership, all different levels of experience, but also everybody's on a different, at a different stage in their journey when it comes to these
yeah,
things. So, yeah, I think magic happens when there's open minds in a room.
right. Absolutely, absolutely. We have a couple minutes left, so if you have any other questions for Carly and I, please, certainly ask in the Q&A function, or if you want to set up a time to speak with both one or both of us more about the topic of psychological safety in the workplace, ways you might be able to get involved in the movement to promote psychological safety in the workplace. There are many groups and organizations that are working in different states or nationally
Mm.
on this topic, and certainly if you know an organization, whether it's your organization or any others in your network that would be good for this training or might be interested, please let us know. We really greatly appreciate that. There is one other question that Jason asked, and I think it's a good time to present it now since we talked about helping leaders on this journey. And Jason asked, I'm just trying to find the question, how can a leader begin the journey of, so let's say they come to us and they kind of meet the requirements we're looking for. They're open-minded, they want to take this on regardless of what their workplace situation looks like. How can we begin this journey with them?
Well, I think it's really sitting down and understanding where they are right now. I love that there's usually three questions that I ask. Doesn't matter if I've got my consultant hat on or my coaching hat.
Yeah,
And Edgar, I'd say you're probably the same. Where are you now? Where do you want to be?
yeah,
And what's stopping you from getting there? Because what we do together, Edgar and I, as part of this training program, is we help you with that bit in the middle, which is you may have embarked or started or initiated a part of this change or a part of this journey previously, and for whatever reason, it stopped, it faltered, or it just wasn't successful.
right.
And so initially, I think those are the three really pertinent questions that we ask is, where are you now on this journey? If you're at the very beginning and this is the first time you're talking about
Hmm.
it or the very first step, wonderful. We love courage in leaders, don't we?
Yeah,
So I think that those would be the first three questions and the first part of the very first step. And then it's talking to them about well, what that journey will look like for them.
Yeah.
So a part of it will be understanding some of their workplace culture, definitely, but also the team and workplace dynamics. What are the challenges that they're experiencing, or that if they've started this and not succeeded before, what were the challenges that stopped them from succeeding or continuing on this journey? Um, yeah, and then talking them
Yeah.
through the training and what are the elements that we've included in the training that would be most pertinent to them,
Right.
and are there areas where, you know, that best align and address the challenges that they might be experiencing in their current workplace that they want us to really focus on. And then we can also talk about other things like leadership coaching and
Right.
things like that
Right.
that you and I both do.
Yeah, and the one parting shot I would have on that particular question is the idea of measurable and attainable goals,
Mm.
right? Change management, or instituting a new thing in any organization doesn't it takes time, and you have to have measurable goals and achievable um, and achievable metrics that one can latch onto. So, all right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for spending this hour with us, and we hope that you got some value out of this conversation and learn more about psychological safety in the workplace and the training that Kylie and I can do for your organization, for any organization. And again, if you have any questions for us, please reach out. Our contact information is in all the marketing you receive for this webinar, and we hope to interact with you soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Edgar.
Yep. Thank you.